They believed that a 10-year-old wouldn't notice the silent tension, the hand reaching out, and the spark of anger directed at a man who had done nothing but follow his orders. They were wrong, because when the queen consort raised her hand not in greeting, not in ceremony, but in anger, it was not a guard who stopped her. It was Charlotte, the princess. Before I tell you how the future of the monarchy was in the hands of a soldier and a scandal, make sure you are subscribed and have the bell icon switched on. Also, don't forget to like the video, please, and leave a comment to let us know where in the world you're watching from. Because what happened next, nobody could have seen it coming. The October air around Clarence House had that London chill that makes tourists draw their coats tighter and locals move quicker. Amber leaves crunched under the feet of youngsters who were queued up behind velvet ropes. Their small hands held tiny Union Jacks that fluttered in the wind like scared birds. It was meant to be easy, just a chance to take a picture. Queen Consort Camilla giving a formal donation to a children's hospice with Princess Charlotte beside her to sweeten the headlines. The kind of thing that fills up royal schedules between state visits and constitutional duties. Sergeant Ellis Warrick knew better than to believe simplistic. He stood 32 steps away from the raised stone platform, his Coldstream Guard uniform pressed to a knife-edge precision. His rifle was clutched at his shoulder, and he was so quiet that tourists wondered if he was even breathing. He was 6 feet 3 inches tall in his boots, and had the kind of alertness that came from areas where paying attention meant staying alive. He possessed those eyes because he had been to Helmand twice. They could see movement before it happened, and raid crowds like other people read newspapers. The doctor claimed he had earned his retirement since shrapnel from a roadside bomb had gotten close to his spine. But Ellis chose the bearskin because it reminded him of Lance Corporal Davis. Davies had only 3 weeks left until his deployment when he agreed to a simple task, to accompany a diplomatic convoy to what everyone considered a safe facility. There hasn't been any unfriendly action in the area for months. Simple job, the kind of job you offered to soldiers who had already been in perilous regions. The bomb that killed Davies and 2 other people was concealed under a road that had been cleared every day for 6 months. It was safe until it wasn't. Ellis learned something that most people don't. Putting risk in a nicer place doesn't make it go away. It just gets better at hiding. And as soon as you stop treating protocol like a lifeline and start considering it like a recommendation, people die. They die, though, only a tiny bit at a time. It might not be from bombs or blood and smoke. Every time someone in charge thinks the rules don't apply to them. That old instinct was buzzing like a live wire today. He couldn't put his finger on it. Just little things that didn't quite fit. The way one of the junior aides kept walking back and forth near the press line and looking at his watch every 30 seconds. The Royal Protection officers looked more stressed than normal for a children's charity function. There were more photographers than usual, and they were set up in a way that made it seem like they knew something was about to happen. Queen Camilla smiled for the cameras on the stage with practiced friendliness. Her sapphire brooch caught the afternoon light, but Ellis saw that her fingers were gripping her cards a little too tightly, and that her gaze kept darting toward the rope barricades with what seemed like annoyance. Princess Charlotte sat next to her, calm and steady like someone who had been performing in public since before she could walk well. 10 years old, her powder blue coat buttoned up perfectly, and her hands were folded in her lap like she was posing for a picture. But she didn't pay attention to the cameras or the people. She was looking at him. They looked at one another across the courtyard for a time. Charlotte didn't wave or grin. That wasn't what she was supposed to do right now. But something happened between them. Maybe recognition. The kind that happens amongst people who know how to do their jobs well, even when everyone else wants them to do it differently. Ellis looked back at the edge, but the feeling in his chest was like a countdown, counting down. The danger would start little, like it always did, and when it did, he'd be ready. The first test came in the form of a straightforward request. A junior aide in a navy suit came over from the press section, holding a clipboard against his chest like it was armor. He had the jittery energy of someone who was carrying a message they didn't really believe in. He told the Royal Protection officer who was standing at the west barrier, "They need the press line moved forward 3 feet. The lens angles are cutting off the edge of the platform." The cop didn't even blink. "Protocol says the line holds. They've gotten the okay from media operations. Media ops can clear it with security command after that. Until then, the perimeter stays." The aide's jaw got stiff. Instead, he turned to Ellis, perhaps because he thought it would be easier to push around a ceremonial guard than armed security. "Sergeant, we need your help moving the rope line. Just a little bit forward." Ellis stayed still. He talked with the flat assurance of someone who had learned not to argue with poor ideas. Royal Protection Command set this position at 13:10 hours. Major Hulton must approve any changes. "We're talking about 3 feet. Sir, we're talking about protocol." The aide's mouth opened and then closed. People he thought were pretty didn't usually say no to him. He turned around and went away after a moment, holding his clipboard against his chest like he was guarding important organs. But Ellis saw the swift motion toward his earpiece as he backed away, the quiet talk and the look back over his shoulder. The aide couldn't state on camera what he really meant, which was that this had nothing to do with the angles of the photos. 3 separate media outlets had been offered access to today's event that had never been given before, access that hinged on taking certain images from certain angles. The kind of access that was paid for ahead of time, with invoices already sent and expectations already set. Ellis had no idea that he was standing in the exact area that would spoil a £50,000 picture package. He wasn't bad at his job. He was just following the rules perfectly, no matter what it cost the palace's public relations. There was already a voice in the aide's ear asking for answers. "Why is the guard still there? We paid for clear sightlines." The aide couldn't explain that the guard was obeying the rules as they were supposed to be, not the ones they had planned to discreetly change. Couldn't acknowledge that they thought a ceremonial soldier would be easier to transport than real security. This wasn't done. Queen Camilla's grin on the platform stopped for a split second, just long enough for someone who was paying attention to see the annoyance behind her eyes before the practiced warmth came back. Charlotte had seen it too. She moved a little in her chair, not enough to lose her calm posture, but enough to see better what was going on below. She didn't need to know the details to see what it was. Adults trying to get someone to do something they shouldn't. She had learnt that lesson early on in palaces. Power didn't always show itself with crowns and festivities. It would come silently, dressed in fine clothes, carrying clipboards, and speaking in nice tones that weren't actually polite at all. 10 minutes later, another aide came up. This one was older, bald, and had the kind of assurance that comes from solving other people's issues for 30 years. He pointed to the velvet rope and muttered something to the steward in uniform next to it. The steward shook his head. The aide's hand advanced toward the barrier, as if he were going to fix it himself. "Sir." Ellis's voice rang out in the courtyard like a gunshot. "Please don't touch the cordon." The man looked up, his eyebrows lifted in the way that everyone does when they can't believe the help was asking them questions. "Excuse me?" That line marks the operational perimeter. Moving it would break the safety zone set up by Royal Protection Command. Before any changes can be made, I need to hear from Major Loken. There was a long delay, the kind that happens when someone has to decide whether to move forward or back off. The aide's face went through a lot of different emotions before resting on a look of tight-lipped anger. "This is crazy," he said under his breath, but he stepped back from the rope. Camilla didn't try to hide how she felt this time. She leaned over to one of her ladies-in-waiting and murmured something that made the woman's eyebrows go up. Both of them glanced at Ellis with faces that could have frozen the Thames. Charlotte's shoulders had gotten a little tighter over them. She kept her eyes on the road, but Ellis could feel her focus like a weight. She was watching and learning, storing away the facts of what happened when someone tried to perform their job well in a world that liked easy ways out. Charlotte had seen this pattern previously when things were quieter behind the palace gates. The way some staff members would suddenly become hard to deal with when they wouldn't follow guidelines that weren't meant to be broken. How security officers would be moved to a different job after refusing to ignore violations of the rules. The slow but steady loss of persons who put duty ahead of convenience. She had heard the adult conversations that halted when she walked into a room. They were quiet complaints about guards who didn't know their place in the new order. The strict separation between ceremonial obligations and genuine security, as if upholding tradition and dignity was less important than safeguarding structures and people. Charlotte might not have comprehended the politics at 10, but she did understand the pattern. When good individuals wouldn't give in, they were pushed aside, and after they left, the next individual had to make the same choice, bend or break. She had seen her grandfather deal with similar kinds of stress all his life. The ongoing struggle between doing the right thing and doing what was easiest, and how principle became a luxury when public relations needed flexibility. But she also learned something else from seeing her grandfather, that a tiny gesture at the right time might make a big difference, that being a leader didn't mean having the most power. It was about understanding when to use the power you had. Ellis's pulse had returned to normal, but his jaw was still stiff under the shade of his bearskin. The probes weren't random. They were methodical, testing his strength and looking for the point at which he would give in rather than stand firm. They had chosen the wrong soldier for that test, and they were about to learn why. When Queen Camilla got up from her chair, it should have been a smooth transition into the next part of the show. She should have walked down to greet the children from the hospice with a warm smile for the cameras, the kind of unplanned move that publicists liked and security guards quietly hated. But she didn't smooth her cream coat or speak softly as she turned to her senior aide. "Please let me greet the kids in person," she begged. It wasn't truly a request. The aide got tense. "Ma'am, that would mean moving the security line." "Then move it." The way she said it might have cut glass. "I don't want too much ceremony to ruin this moment." She didn't wait for an answer. She was already on her way to the steps. The senior aide almost ran down from the platform, and his partner followed him closely as they headed straight for the rope barrier. This was no longer a polite request. This was real-time damage management, with cameras rolling and a reputation to preserve. They got to Ellis's position, and the lead aide scarcely slowed pace. "Sergeant, Her Majesty is coming up to greet the children. We need a 10-foot path through this line right away." Ellis didn't even blink. That can't happen without a perimeter rescan and security clearance. "This is a ceremonial event." "This is a live operational zone, sir. You need permission from the chain of command to change it." The second aide moved closer, and his professional demeanor began to break down. "You're kidding. She's the Queen Consort. She's also under protection protocol," Ellis said in the same calm voice he had used to announce contact in Sanguine. "And my orders can't be changed without the right permission." The first aide looked urgently at the platform where Camilla had reached the bottom of the steps and was plainly hoping the way would be clear. When he looked back at Ellis, his voice was a mix of begging and threatening. "You've done this before. Last month, you made things hard during the flower ceremony. The staff at home were not happy." Ellis had heard the rumors. The hard one. The soldier who didn't remember that the war was over. But the job was still the same, even though the view was better. He didn't care about feelings. He kept people safe. "That's all, sir. I follow written instructions." But Ellis could see the change in their expressions, even as he spoke it. They were no longer fighting about safety. They were disputing about who was in charge and who got to decide when rules were important and when they weren't. And that dispute was going to get very close to home. Camilla's heel pounded against the stone behind her as she waited for a passage that wasn't coming. The aide's voice got stronger. "Sergeant, you're making us take this to the next level. I'm just doing my job. That's all." Charlotte sat in her chair on the platform and watched everything happen with the clear eyes of a child who knows how silly adults can be. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could read their body language well. The assistants leaned forward as if they were attempting to go past an unseen wall. The guards stood perfectly motionless, not moving or being moved. The way her grandmother stood at the bottom of the steps, plainly waiting for someone to address things right now. Charlotte had been in enough palaces to know when being courteous ceased being polite. When the voices of adults had that certain edge, it signified that someone was about to get wounded. She moved around in her chair, not enough to break the rules, but enough to see everything clearly. Something told her she would need to recall exactly how this happened. Camilla didn't tell him to move, did not give a command, make a formal request, or even raise her voice. She just went across the cobblestones towards Sergeant Ellis Warrick at a slow, steady pace, as if she had spent decades having doors opened for her. The afternoon wind blew through her cream coat, and the sound of her heels clicking on the stone was like a sure thing. But she wasn't walking toward the kids anymore. She was headed toward the man who had said no. Ellis registered the approach the way he'd learned to in locations where the incorrect reaction could get everyone killed, He kept his weight steady, maintained his breathing, and kept his eyes on the movement without moving his head. The cameras saw it right away. The shutters started to click like prayers that were going off quickly. A BBC microphone turned toward the fight that was starting to happen. Behind the rope line, tourists started to take out their phones because they could see something was going on that wasn't normal. One woman spoke softly in German to her husband. A bunch of teens stopped taking pictures of themselves and started recording instead. Charlotte leaned forward in her seat. Camilla halted just short of the guard line. Her voice was low enough that the press couldn't hear her, yet clear enough that every syllable hit like a hammer. "Sergeant, you are getting in the way of my engagement." Ellis answered without looking. "Ma'am, I'm following orders to keep this area secure until security says it's okay to make changes." "You were told this was okay." "I was told to break the rules, but I can't do that." Now her smile was completely gone. "You're not a commanding officer, you're a ceremonial guard." He said, "I'm a serving member of the Household Division, working under direct orders from Royal Protection Command." He spoke it with the flat accuracy of someone reading rules under fire. The aide behind her really did wince. More cameras were moving now. People who were only watching the rope line had grabbed up their phones. Someone with a heavy American accent said, "What's going on?" in a way that was louder than they meant it to be. Camilla's voice got sharper, like a knife being drawn. "You've made this family look bad for the last time." Ellis seemed like he was made of the same stone as the edifice behind him. "Ma'am, my job is to keep this space safe, not decorate it." That was when her face changed. Not quite fury, not quite shame, but something smaller and more dangerous. The rage of someone whose authority had been called into question in public by someone who wouldn't back down. Her hand, which had been pointing to the platform, stayed in the air for a moment longer than it needed to. Ellis noticed the change, the tightness in her shoulders, and the way her fingers curled a little, as if muscle memory was taking over for conscious thought. Charlotte got up from the platform. She didn't ask anyone in the throng for permission or glance at them. She got up from her chair and walked toward the steps, with the same calm purpose she had showed all afternoon. Camilla's hand went up higher. The movement had every camera in the courtyard turned toward it, and in that area between impulse and action, between authority and responsibility, the Queen Consort's hand pulled back as if she were getting ready to teach someone a lesson about respect. The child was already on the move to stop her. It felt like time slowed down like it does before an accident, when everyone can see what's about to happen but no one can quite accept it. Camilla's hand was hanging at shoulder level, and her fingers weren't quite clenched into a fist, but they were holding on to something tighter than a gesture. Her face showed more than just annoyance. It showed real, unguarded rage at being disobeyed in public, which royal personnel were instructed never to perceive. Sergeant Warrick stood completely still, not because he was frozen, but because he had learned in Afghanistan that the best way to deal with incoming fire was to make himself as small a target as possible. His breathing had slowed to the beat of battle. His gaze stayed focused straight ahead, but he could see everything out of the corner of his eye. The rising hand, the tight muscles, and the split-second calculation going on behind Camilla's eyes as royal training fought with human impulse. She was going to do it. Not because she was mean or liked violence, but because all the rigorous rules, media training, and years of being calm in public had turned into something far simpler. She was going to get back at someone who had embarrassed her. The cameras were already rolling, the lenses were focused, and the shutters were clicking quickly as photographers perceived the exact moment when the ceremony turned into something else. Then a little hand grabbed her wrist, not violently or theatrically, just a child's fingers locking gently but firmly around her grandmother's arm, stopping the motion as easily as catching a falling glass. Ellis had never heard anything like the noise that came from the audience in 12 years of ceremonial duty. Not cheers or gasps, but something more basic, the sound of everyone taking a deep breath when they realize they're seeing something they'll never forget. Princess Charlotte had traversed the courtyard and climbed down from the platform so softly that most people didn't even see her move. Now she was right next to Camilla, her powder blue coat brushing against her cream coat, and her small hand was wrapped around a wrist that had been directed at a guard's face. When she spoke, it was just above a whisper. Please don't." Soft as silk, 2 words, but they cut through the midday air like a knife through water, making everything and everyone quiet. Camilla stared down at her granddaughter with a face that was a mix of shock and maybe shame. Her arm went limp right away, and the fight left her like air from a balloon that had been popped. Ellis stayed still, couldn't move. His training told him to stay alert, but something more than training was telling him that the smallest person in the courtyard was writing history. Charlotte didn't let go right away. She clutched her grandmother's wrist for a little longer to make sure the danger was over. Then her hand dropped away, but she didn't move back. Instead, she looked at Ellis. She gazed up at him. He was a guy almost twice her height, dressed in red and steel, and trained to be as still as the edifice behind him. But when their eyes met, she didn't look scared or unsure. She just looked like she knew him. One person recognizing another. She just said, "Thank you for doing your job." Ellis couldn't answer. He wasn't allowed to say anything other than direct orders. But something about the way he stood changed. Charlotte could see it, but it wasn't enough for cameras to catch. She turned around to look at Camilla again, who was still standing at the bottom of the platform steps, frozen. Charlotte's voice stayed gentle and childlike, but you could tell there was steel below it. "You can't do that." Not blaming, not disobedient, just saying something that everyone in the courtyard already knew, but was too scared to utter out loud. Camilla's lips opened, but no sound came out. Journalists were writing down notes that they didn't know how to say. People were writing headlines that didn't include verbs. Even though they weren't sure what they were photographing anymore, the camera operators kept filming since they didn't know how to stop. Charlotte didn't wait for a response. She turned around and walked back to the platform with the same calm dignity she had displayed all afternoon. She wasn't in a hurry or upset. She was just a youngster who had done what she needed to do and was now going back to her station. But she stopped for a second before going up the steps. She turned around and gazed at Ellis one last time, not with adulation or hero worship, but with something deeper, the respect that comes from knowing what it means to stand your ground when everyone else wants you to give in. After that, she was gone, going back to her seat by descending the stone steps. Camilla stood still and watched her granddaughter go away. She realized that the 10-year-old in the powder blue coat had just taught her something about being a leader that 30 years of royal training had never taught her. No one moved for a long time. The aides stood around nervously, torn between rushing to fix things and acting like nothing had occurred. The photographers kept their cameras up and took picture after picture because they knew this was greater than anything else they had planned to cover that day. Ellis stayed at his post, looking straight ahead and standing still like he was in a ceremony. But something had changed inside. He had stood through mortar fire in Helmand, seen pals bleed out in dusty alleys, and put up with the endless stream of dignitaries who treated soldiers like furniture in attractive uniforms. Seeing a child standing between him and the crown, and telling the truth that no one else would had shaken him more than anything else. Charlotte had sat back down on the platform, with her hands folded in her lap and her posture flawless, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But her eyes gave her away. They didn't have the dreamy look of a child going through a ceremony. They were steady and concentrated, conveying the silent weight of someone who knew exactly what she had done. Camilla stayed still for a few more seconds before turning quickly and gesturing to her attendants with a flick of her wrist. The message was clear. This moment would not be talked about, acknowledged, or allowed to exist outside of the thoughts of those who had seen it. But it was already there, of course. Many phones had taken pictures of it. It had been shown live on more than one camera. Social media would be all over it in less than an hour. And in those shaky bits of video and half-heard whispers, the world would see what the official record would try so hard to hide, that on a normal afternoon at Clarence House, the smallest member of the royal family had drawn a line in the sand that no one else had dared to cross. Prince William would kneel alongside his daughter's bed later that night in a secluded room away from the cameras. Charlotte would be half asleep by now, with her hair cascading over the pillow like a golden crown that was more real than anything in the Tower of London. "You were very brave today," he would add softly. Her eyes would flutter open just enough to see him. "I just stopped her." Yes, his voice would break because there were things even a father couldn't change, and sometimes that's the most brave thing anyone can do. She would frown a little, which was how she always looked when she was thinking about a problem. Will he get in trouble? The guard? William would shake his head. He did what he was supposed to do, and that's always right. Her little hand would discover his. It didn't feel right, what she was up to. That's because it was. There would be silence between them, heavy, but not too much. The kind of silence that means something instead of nothing. He would kiss her forehead and say, "Go to sleep, Lottie. You've done enough for today." And she would fall asleep, not knowing that people were watching the video of a small girl in a powder blue coat putting her hand on her grandmother's wrist and repeating 2 words that were louder than any royal order in bars, living rooms, and newsrooms all over the city. Don't do it. The day would conclude for Sergeant Ellis Warrick, the same way it always did. He would go back to his barracks, hang up his uniform, and clean the shine off his boots until the leather sparkled. He would stand watch again tomorrow, motionless and quiet, his presence both an adornment and a warning. But something inside him was different now. He had always thought that responsibility was a lonely road that only some men followed, and others broke. He knew he wasn't the only one now. A 10-year-old girl in the palace knew exactly what it meant to hold the line. And Queen Camilla would never talk about that day again. Not in official briefings, not in family talks, and not in the unending paperwork that came after royal events. The footage would be gently hidden, the headlines would be changed, and the story would be carefully rewritten until it sounded like what the palace wanted to say. But memories have a way of getting lost, and the visitors with shaky phone films, the photographers with unedited reels, and the journalists who had seen more than they were meant to, would all remember. They would remember the hand that was lifted. They would remember the soldier who stayed still. They would remember the girl who said no. And maybe, years later, when Charlotte was 20 or 30 instead of 10, and her role in the family needed more than just good posture and nice smiles, those memories would come back. People would remember the day she stood in the courtyard of Clarence House and showed everyone that leaders don't need crowns or titles. You have to recognize what's right and wrong and have the guts to do something about it. Because in the end, the mighty don't write history. It was written by the times when power couldn't do anything. And that spring afternoon in London, a child in a powder blue coat made history.